I remember when life still felt normal. My wife, Sarah, and I had been married for 6 years. We had two beautiful boys, ages 2 and 4, and I thought we were living the perfect life. We had met in college, clicked immediately, and it was like a dream to marry my best friend. We had our ups and downs like every couple, but nothing could prepare me for what was coming. Sarah's pregnancy had come as a surprise last year. We hadn't really planned on having a third child so soon, but once the news settled in, I was excited. Our family was growing, and I imagined how this new baby would complete the picture. We talked about the future like everything was normal. Baby names, nursery colors, and how we would balance life with 3 kids. I attended every doctor's appointment with her, holding her hand through ultrasounds, reassuring her when she had morning sickness. It was hard not to notice that she seemed more distant lately, but I chalked it up to stress and the usual pregnancy mood swings. I was working long hours at the time, trying to provide for our growing family, and often came home exhausted. Sarah was usually quiet in the evenings, not her usual chatty self. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying it was just hormones or that she was tired from running after the boys all day. I believed her because I had no reason not to. Everything changed on the day she gave birth. I was in the delivery room, holding her hand as she screamed through contractions. The moment our baby girl was born, the room fell silent. There was this long pause where I couldn't figure out what was happening. I kept waiting for the usual celebration that came after a birth, the doctor's congratulatory words, the baby's first cry. But all I saw was the doctor exchanging a glance with the nurses and Sarah turning pale. When they finally handed me the baby, I froze. She was beautiful, but something was unmistakably different. Her skin was dark, clearly not like mine or Sarah's, both of us being white. For a moment, I couldn't even process what I was seeing. I just stared at this child, knowing deep in my gut something was wrong. But the voice in my head kept saying, "No, it's impossible. This can't be what I think it is." Sarah didn't meet my eyes. She turned her head, tears already streaming down her face. In that instant, I knew the truth before she even said a word. My whole world collapsed in those seconds. This wasn't my child. The drive home from the hospital was a blur. Sarah sat beside me in silence, cradling the baby in her arms. I couldn't bring myself to even glance at them. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly I thought it might snap. The silence between us was suffocating, but I didn't have the strength to say what was burning inside me. When we got home, I mechanically went through the motions, helping Sarah settle in with the baby, making sure our boys didn't disturb her. But inside, I was screaming. The questions, the anger, the disbelief. It all crashed over me like waves, but I kept quiet. I didn't want to explode in front of our children. Late that night, when the boys were finally asleep, Sarah and I sat in the living room. She was still holding the baby, her face streaked with tears. I stared at the floor, my mind swirling with every possible explanation, none of them good. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't respond. I couldn't. "I never meant for this to happen, James. I swear." She broke down, sobbing, but I couldn't move. I couldn't comfort her. All I could do was replay every moment in my head, every time I trusted her, loved her, every memory we'd built together. And now this. When? I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. She wiped her tears and took a shaky breath. "It was last year, around the holidays." The holidays. The time we spent with family, the cozy nights, the joy of seeing our boys open their presents. My stomach churned at the thought that, during all that, this had been happening. "It was just a mistake," she continued, her voice breaking. "I didn't even know until the baby came. I never thought." I couldn't listen anymore. "Whose is it?" I asked, my voice cold and distant. Sarah hesitated. It was just a one-night stand. I don't even know his name." Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. She didn't even know his name? How could she have thrown everything we had away for someone she couldn't even remember? My chest tightened, and for the first time, the anger started to surface. "You cheated on me," I said, the words finally spilling out. "You lied to me all this time, and you didn't even tell me until this." I gestured toward the baby, who was now fast asleep in Sarah's arms. "I'm sorry," she cried. "I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to lose you." "Lose me?" I said, my voice rising. "You already lost me the moment you decided to cheat." We sat in silence for what felt like hours. I wanted to scream, to break something, but all I could do was sit there, numb. Sarah looked as broken as I felt, but I didn't care anymore. She had betrayed me in the worst way possible, and now we were here, our family shattered. Finally, I stood up. "I need to get out of here," I muttered, grabbing my keys. "James, please, don't leave like this," Sarah begged, her eyes wide with panic. But I couldn't stay. Not right now. I couldn't breathe in that house anymore, with the weight of everything crushing me. "I just need to think," I said, my voice flat. Then I walked out the door, leaving behind the life I thought I knew. I drove aimlessly through the night, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Sarah, the woman I loved, the mother of my children, had been with another man. And now there was this baby, this child that wasn't mine, but somehow was now part of my life. Every stoplight, every quiet street I passed, felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. My mind kept returning to that moment in the hospital, when I held that baby and realized everything was different. How had I missed the signs? How had I been so blind? Memories flashed through my mind. The times she'd been distant, the nights she stayed out late, claiming she was visiting friends. I had asked her once if something was wrong, but she brushed it off. And I believed her. I trusted her. Now that trust was shattered, I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking. I wanted to cry, to scream, but nothing came out. I just sat there, staring blankly into the darkness, my heart aching with the weight of betrayal. I couldn't even think straight. What was I supposed to do now? Should I leave her? Could I even look at her the same way again? I thought about the boys. They were too young to understand what was happening, but one day they would. And this baby girl, what would she mean to them? Would they grow up resenting her? Would they blame her for what had happened between Sarah and me? I didn't know how to handle any of it. I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Please come back. We need to talk." But I wasn't ready to face her. Not yet. I ignored Sarah's message and threw my phone onto the passenger seat, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions that I could barely keep under control. Everything felt surreal, like my life had been yanked out from under me, leaving me in this confusing limbo where nothing made sense. I turned the engine back on and kept driving, hoping that somewhere in the distance, I'd find a way to clear my head. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about everything. The trust, the future I thought we had, the way my children's lives were now tangled in this mess. How was I supposed to explain to my boys that their new baby sister wasn't really their sister? What would they think when they were old enough to understand? A few miles down the road, I found myself parked in front of a small, deserted park. The empty swings swayed gently in the breeze, and for some reason, the sight of them brought a lump to my throat. This was the place I used to bring the boys when they were younger. Sarah would pack a picnic, and we'd spend the afternoons pushing them on the swings, laughing, enjoying the simplicity of family life. I had loved those moments, holding my boys in my arms, watching Sarah smile at me with what I thought was genuine love. But now, everything was a lie. Or had it been for a long time, and I just didn't see it? I got out of the car and walked over to one of the swings, sitting down heavily. The cool night air stung my face, but I didn't care. I needed the numbness, the silence. I needed something to ground me, anything that didn't feel like it was slipping through my fingers. My mind drifted back to the day Sarah and I met. It was in college, at a mutual friend's party. She had this way of lighting up a room, her laugh contagious, her eyes always filled with this spark of mischief. I was drawn to her instantly. She was the kind of woman I had dreamed about, intelligent, funny, beautiful, and she chose me. I had always felt lucky to have her, like I had somehow won a prize I didn't deserve. Now, sitting on that swing, I couldn't help but wonder if I had been a fool from the start. How could I have been so blind to her betrayal? But another thought gnawed at me, one I had been trying to avoid since I walked out of the house. Maybe it wasn't just about her. Maybe I had failed her too, in ways I couldn't even see. I had been so caught up in work, in providing for the family, that maybe I hadn't seen her slipping away. Was that why she had looked elsewhere? Did I push her into the arms of another man? No, I told myself. This is not your fault. She made the choice to cheat. But still, the doubt crept in, and I hated myself for it. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in my thoughts. The cold started to seep into my bones, but I couldn't move. I didn't want to go home. Home didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a battlefield, a place where the truth had detonated, and all that was left were the shattered pieces of what used to be my life. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing again. I groggily reached for it, expecting another message from Sarah, but it wasn't her this time. It was my brother, Kyle. Hey man, you okay? Sarah called me. She's worried. Worried? That word felt hollow, given what she had done. How could she be worried about me when she had been the one to tear our lives apart? I don't know, Kyle, I said, my voice barely audible. I don't even know what to do. There was a long pause on the other end before Kyle responded. You don't have to know right now. You're allowed to feel this way. Just don't shut down. Don't do anything rash. I closed my eyes, trying to absorb his words, but it was hard. I didn't want to think rationally. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to make her feel the same pain she had caused me. But deep down, I knew Kyle was right. Whatever I did next would shape everything. My marriage, my kids, even the baby that wasn't mine. And despite everything, I wasn't the type to make decisions I couldn't take back. I don't know if I can go back, Kyle, I admitted, the words thick with emotion. I can't look at her without seeing what she did. You don't have to go back tonight, he replied gently. Just take your time. But don't let this eat you alive. Talk to her when you're ready. I knew he meant well, but the idea of talking to Sarah felt impossible. What was there left to say? The betrayal was out in the open, and no amount of words could undo it. But then, what was my alternative? Walking away? Leaving my boys to deal with the fallout? The thought of them growing up in a broken home twisted my stomach in knots. Thanks, man, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I need some space. Take it, but don't disappear on us, all right? I won't, I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. I hung up the phone and stared out at the empty park, my heart heavy with everything I didn't know how to process. I wasn't ready to face Sarah yet, but I also knew I couldn't stay away forever. At some point, I would have to confront her, and make a decision about what our future would look like. If there even was a future. Eventually, the cold became too much, and I realized I couldn't avoid going home any longer. I had nowhere else to go, nowhere else I could hide from this reality. So, I got back in the car, my body tense as I drove toward the house. Each mile felt heavier, the weight of what awaited me growing with every turn. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always did, quiet, welcoming. But I knew that wasn't true anymore. This wasn't home. It was the place where everything had fallen apart. I hesitated at the door, my hand resting on the knob for what felt like an eternity. Part of me wanted to turn around and drive away, to never come back. But the other part, the part that still loved my children, that still remembered the life we had built, forced me to open the door. The house was silent when I stepped inside. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked up at me as I entered, but she didn't say a word. The baby was asleep in a bassinet nearby, oblivious to the storm that had erupted around her. I didn't sit down. I couldn't. The distance between Sarah and me felt insurmountable, even though we were only a few feet apart. James, she began softly, her voice trembling. Don't, I interrupted, my voice cold. Not right now. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but she stayed silent. There was nothing more to say. Not tonight. I couldn't handle it. Not yet. I'm going to bed, I muttered, and without another word, I turned and walked down the hallway, leaving her alone with the baby that had become a living reminder of her betrayal. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling. I could hear the faint sounds of Sarah moving around the house, the creak of the floorboards as she checked on the baby. It was surreal to think that just a few days ago, I had been excited to welcome our third child into the family. Now, it felt like that baby had brought the end of everything I knew. Sleep didn't come, and when the morning light filtered through the blinds, I was still wide awake. I heard the boys stirring in their rooms, their voices breaking the silence of the house. Normally, I'd get up, make them breakfast, play with them before starting the day. But I couldn't move. I couldn't face them. How could I pretend everything was normal when the foundation of our family had been ripped apart? Eventually, Sarah came into the bedroom. She stood awkwardly at the door, her eyes red and puffy. "The boys are asking for you," she said quietly. I sat up, rubbing my face, feeling the weight of exhaustion pull at me. "I'll be out in a minute," I muttered. She hesitated, like she wanted to say something more, but then thought better of it and left. I didn't know how to handle her anymore. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was the betrayal, the lies. But then I thought about the boys. They didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of all this. They were innocent, and I couldn't let them see the cracks in our world. Over the next few days, I focused on the boys, trying to act like nothing was wrong. I played with them, took them to the park, even read their favorite bedtime stories like I always had. But it felt like I was wearing a mask. Behind every smile I forced, every laugh I faked, the anger simmered beneath the surface. Sarah tried to talk to me a few times, but I always shut her down. I wasn't ready. Every time she opened her mouth, I feared what more she might confess. I wasn't sure I could handle any more truths. I was already drowning in what I knew. But the longer I avoided her, the more suffocating the atmosphere in the house became. We couldn't keep living like this, tiptoeing around each other, pretending for the boys' sake. Something had to give. We couldn't go on forever in this strange limbo, where we were neither together nor apart. The baby, on the other hand, was a constant presence, a living reminder of the affair. I hadn't touched her since that day in the hospital. Sarah cared for her, but every time I heard her cry or saw Sarah feeding her, it tore me apart. It wasn't until a week later that the tension finally boiled over. It was late one evening, after the boys had gone to bed. Sarah was sitting in the living room, holding the baby, rocking her gently. I stood in the doorway, watching them, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "We need to talk," I said, my voice strained. Sarah looked up at me, her eyes filled with fear. She nodded, setting the baby down in her bassinet. I sat down across from her, the silence between us heavy, like a storm waiting to break. "How long were you going to lie to me?" I asked, the anger I had been bottling up for days finally spilling out. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't let her. "How long, Sarah? Were you going to tell me eventually, or did you hope I'd just accept this baby without ever knowing the truth?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head. "I was going to tell you, but I was so scared. I didn't know how to. I was terrified you'd leave me." I let out a bitter laugh. "Well, you should have thought of that before you slept with someone else." "I made a mistake, James," she whispered. "It was one night, and I hate myself for it. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want to lose you." The anger surged inside me again. "You already did," I snapped. "You lost me the moment you decided to cheat." Her sobs filled the room, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not this time. I was too angry, too broken. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed adequate. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to look at you, how to be around this baby." Sarah looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "I know I hurt you, but I love you. Please, James. I don't want to lose our family." But her words didn't reach me. I was already too far gone. That night, after our heated argument, I lay awake again, wrestling with my thoughts. Could I ever forgive her? Could we ever get back to what we had before? Or was that version of us already gone, destroyed by the choices she had made? The baby cried in the next room, and I clenched my fists. This child was innocent in all of this, but she was also a symbol of the betrayal. Could I raise her as my own, knowing she wasn't mine? Could I pretend that this affair never happened? Eventually, the thoughts became too much, and I got out of bed, quietly making my way to the living room. Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from crying, the baby still in her bassinet beside her. I stood there for a moment, staring at them, my wife and this child that had been thrust into my life through lies. For a brief moment, I considered walking out, just leaving everything behind, disappearing into the night, and starting over somewhere new. But then I thought about the boys, about how much they needed me. If I left, I'd be abandoning them too. They were my world, and despite everything, I couldn't be the father who ran away when things got hard. The next morning, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table, the tension between us still palpable. I hadn't said anything to her since our argument, but now, it felt like there was no choice but to make a decision. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, staring down at my hands. "But I know I can't just leave. The boys need stability. They don't deserve to be dragged into this mess." Sarah's eyes were filled with hope, though I could tell she was still scared of what I might say next. "I'm not saying we can fix this," I continued, my voice heavy. "I don't even know if we can. But for now, I'm staying." She let out a shaky breath, wiping at the tears that were already forming. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm not doing this for you," I added, my tone sharp. "I'm doing this for them. And for now, we'll figure it out. But don't expect things to go back to the way they were." Sarah nodded, her face a mixture of relief and sadness. She knew, just as I did, that there was no going back. Not to the life we had before. We were starting from scratch, and the road ahead was uncertain. In the weeks that followed, we agreed to start counseling. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew that if there was any chance of salvaging our marriage, we needed help. I didn't know how to navigate the anger, the betrayal, or how to even begin to process what had happened. And Sarah, despite her efforts to make amends, was still dealing with the consequences of her actions. Counseling was hard. I hated reliving the moment I found out about the affair, hated talking about the baby. But every session peeled back another layer of hurt, forcing us to confront the mess we had made of our lives. Some days, it felt like we were making progress. We'd have small moments where we'd laugh together, share a memory of the boys, or even talk about the future. But then, something would trigger the pain all over again. A conversation about the baby, an argument about trust, and we'd be right back where we started. It was exhausting. It wasn't long before the boys started asking questions. They were too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, but they sensed the tension between Sarah and me. They noticed how we didn't talk to each other the way we used to, how I avoided holding the baby. "Daddy, why don't you hold the baby?" my older son, Jack, asked one day, his innocent eyes wide with confusion. I froze, not knowing how to answer. How could I explain something so complicated to a 4-year-old? I fumbled for words, trying to come up with a response that wouldn't hurt him. "She's your sister," Jack continued, clearly picking up on more than I had realized. "You're supposed to hold her." I knelt down, pulling him into a hug, my heart aching. "I know, buddy. I know." But I couldn't explain. Not yet. How could I make him understand that the baby he adored wasn't really his sister? That the woman he called Mommy had shattered our family? As time went on, the strain began to take its toll. I found myself withdrawing more, retreating into my work, spending less time at home. The baby was a constant reminder of everything I had lost. And though I loved my boys more than anything, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was suffocating in my own life. Sarah tried, in her own way, to reach out to me, but every attempt felt hollow. The love I had once felt for her had been replaced by resentment, a bitterness I couldn't seem to let go of. One night, after a particularly difficult counseling session, I found myself sitting in the car, contemplating what I had been avoiding for weeks: divorce. Could I really live the rest of my life like this, trapped in a marriage that had been poisoned by lies? That night, I finally broke. I couldn't take it anymore. I told Sarah I wanted a separation. The look on her face was gut-wrenching. Shock, pain, and a desperate plea all wrapped into one. But I was too far gone to care. "We can't do this anymore," I said, my voice hollow. "I've tried. I really have. But I can't live like this. I don't know how to be with you when all I can think about is what you did." Sarah sobbed, begging me to reconsider, But my mind was made up. The counseling, the attempts at forgiveness, it hadn't worked. I was drowning, and I needed to save myself. I'm leaving, I said, the finality in my words hanging in the air. I'll still be here for the boys. But I can't do this anymore. The day I moved out was the hardest day of my life. I hugged the boys tightly, promising them that I'd still be there for them no matter what. I reassured them that none of this was their fault, that Mommy and Daddy still loved them even if we couldn't be together. As for the baby, I didn't know what my role would be in her life. She wasn't mine, but she was still a part of this family. And despite everything, I couldn't hate her. She was just as much a victim of this mess as I was. As I drove away from the house, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. I had lost the life I thought I would have, but maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild something new, something real, something honest. It wasn't the ending I had imagined for myself, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe again.